So you're interested in the Black Death, huh? Well, let me tell you, the more we dig into it, the more it seems like this pandemic was a major turning point.
Yeah, I'd say so.
We've got some incredible sources that show how the Black Death wasn't just a time of, well, death, but really a trigger for some unexpected long-term changes in Europe.
Right, right.
So get ready, because we're going way beyond just the basic facts here and uncovering the Black Death's lasting legacy.
I think a good place to start might be just acknowledging the scale of this pandemic. I mean, think 1346 to 1353. Europe was just ravaged, not just war, but this disease, deadly, obviously.
And the culprit.
Yersinia pestis, that bacteria.
Ah, spread by those fleas on black rats.
Exactly.
Overcrowded cities. And, well, let's just say the sanitation practices weren't exactly stellar.
No, not at all. A perfect breeding ground for a plague.
Really hard to imagine living through that.
It is, yeah. And it's more than just the immediate horror, too. The Black Death, it had ripple effects that went on for centuries. Shaped land ownership, social structures, the whole nine yards.
That's what's so fascinating to me. That's what we're diving into.
Mm.
We all know it was devastating, obviously, but did any good come from it? Any silver lining to this incredibly dark cloud?
Well, think about feudalism. That was the main social system in Europe for ages. Before the Black Death, most peasants were serfs, tied to the land, working for their lords. Then the plague hits, wipes out huge chunks of the population, huge labor shortage. Suddenly, the surviving peasants, they've got leverage. They've never had this before.
So the Black Death actually empowers the peasants. Wow, they must have made some demands then.
They did. Better wages, working conditions, even freedom from being serfs. And the nobles. Well, they needed workers. They had to give in, at least to some extent.
Did this really change the feudal system for good? Or was it just chaos for a bit?
Kind of both, to be honest. Feudalism didn't vanish overnight, but the Black Death definitely weakened it. Take England, for example. They passed the Statute of Laborers, trying to cap wages, keep peasants from moving around too much.
So the nobles, they were trying to claw back control. Did it work?
Not really. The Statute of Laborers and laws like it across Europe, they met a lot of pushback. Peasants had gotten a taste of freedom. They weren't giving it up easily. The Black Death had tipped the scales, and the old ways were being challenged.
Like society was completely shaken up.
Yeah.
And, from the stuff you shared with me, it wasn't just the economics, arts, religion, even people's whole idea of death changed. It's like the Black Death triggered a cultural earthquake.
That's a good way to put it. Imagine living in a time where death is everywhere. You can't escape it. It's just random. No wonder the art from this time is so, creepy. Think Bruegel's Triumph of Death, skeletons everywhere, just wiping people out. A real reflection of how anxious people felt.
And it wasn't just art, right? This whole existential crisis, like,
Yeah.
what's the point of it all, must have led to some pretty extreme religious movements, too.
Oh, absolutely. People were desperate. They needed answers, needed some meaning in all this suffering. Some turned to really radical movements. The Flagellants, for example. They thought they had to punish themselves to appease God, make up for humanity's sins.
So the Black Death forced people to really face their own mortality and question their faith. Must have taken a huge psychological toll.
Incredibly difficult. And, this fear and uncertainty, it led to a darker side of humanity, too. Scapegoating.
You're talking about how Jewish communities were persecuted?
Yeah, sadly. When people are terrified, they don't understand what's happening, they look for someone to blame. In this case, it was the Jewish community, accused of poisoning wells, all sorts of awful things.
Even though there was zero evidence for any of it.
None. But that didn't stop the violence. A tragic reminder that even in times of crisis, reason doesn't always win.
So far, we've seen how the Black Death messed things up socially, economically, how it changed culture, religion. But there's more to the story, right?
Oh, yeah, and this is where it gets really interesting. Despite all the horror, the Black Death also had some good consequences. You could almost say it was like hitting a reset button on European society, led to changes that no one at the time could have even dreamed of.
Okay, now I have to hear this. What good could possibly come from something as awful as the Black Death?
Well, remember that labor shortage? It didn't just weaken feudalism, it opened up opportunities for a new class of people, merchants, artisans.
Hold on, are you saying the Black Death helped create a new economic system?
It's complicated,
Are they-
but some historians think it played a role, yeah, laying the groundwork for how things would work in Europe later on.
Incredible. And there's more, right? What about public health? Weren't there big changes there too?
Absolutely. People started connecting the dots between sanitation and disease. They realized that overcrowding, bad hygiene, it all contributed to the plague spreading.
Well, yeah, after seeing half your city die, You'd probably start paying attention to things like trash and clean water.
Exactly. And this new awareness, it led to quarantines, trying to improve sanitation, and just understanding how diseases spread. It was the start of modern public health.
So the Black Death was more than just a plague. It kick-started progress in public health.
Hmm.
Wow, this is a lot to take in. But we're not done yet, are we? You mentioned something about the Black Death being connected to the Renaissance and the Reformation.
Right, and that's what we'll get into next. The Black Death, by challenging the established order, it created a space for new ideas, new ways of thinking. Like a forest fire, clearing out the old growth so new things can grow.
You're saying the Black Death, as terrible as it was, might have helped start some of the most important cultural and intellectual movements in European history. This is definitely not your typical history lesson.
Not at all. And we'll explore those fascinating connections after a quick break.
All right, so before the break, we were talking about how the Black Death somehow might have helped pave the way for the Renaissance and the Reformation. How does that even work?
Well, you got to remember the huge impact, like psychologically and spiritually, that the Black Death had on Europe. People were really questioning everything.
Like, if this is God's plan, then what's the point, kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And this questioning of authority of the church, it opened things up for new ideas.
Okay, so lots of questioning, a desire for new answers.
Yeah.
How does that lead to, say, Michelangelo's David?
It's like the Black Death really shook up medieval society, which was, all about death and the afterlife. After so much death, well, there's this growing focus on, like, human potential, achievement in this life, not just the next.
So the Black Death kind of shifted the focus from the afterlife to right here, right now. That's a pretty big change.
It is. And this whole human potential thing, celebrating what people can do, that's a big part of the Renaissance. You see it in the art, the writing, the philosophy, everything.
You're right. The Renaissance was all about human ingenuity and creativity. It's wild to think that the Black Death, all that darkness, might have helped spark this amazing cultural explosion.
It is a pretty fascinating connection. And this questioning, it wasn't just an art, it went further to the church itself.
You're talking about the Reformation, right?
Right.
How did the Black Death fit into that?
Well, the church, its authority wasn't what it used to be. People saw it failing during the Black Death. Some felt like, the church didn't really help spiritually or practically.
So people's faith in the church took a hit because of the Black Death.
Yeah, for a lot of people, the plague made them question the church's teachings, its whole ability to give guidance, comfort. And that dissatisfaction, it created an opening for reformers, people like Martin Luther.
Makes sense. Luther's ideas about individual faith, having a direct connection with God, that must have appealed to people who were already doubting the church.
It's pretty remarkable. The Black Death, all that death and destruction, and it might have indirectly helped bring about these huge changes in European thought, art, religion. But there's more to explore, like how it led to some pretty remarkable changes in how societies viewed healthcare.
Right. You were saying earlier, before the break, about how the Black Death made people realize the connection between, like, sanitation and how disease spreads.
Yeah, exactly. The Black Death, it made people face the fact that their living conditions, how clean they were, it could actually be a matter of life or death.
I can imagine that after a pandemic like that, people would be pretty motivated to prevent another one.
Exactly. And that's what happened. They didn't have like germ theory figured out yet, but they started to see that cleanliness, hygiene, it mattered.
So did they actually do anything? Put any public health measures in place?
They did. We see quarantines starting to develop. Ships coming from areas with the plague, they had to stay isolated for a while to stop the disease from spreading.
That's so interesting. So quarantine, which we all know so well now, it comes from the Black Death.
Yep, the Black Death was a turning point in how societies dealt with disease. It forced them to come up with new strategies, new ways to protect public health.
Okay, so we've talked about the Black Death's impact on society, the economy, religion, art, even public health. Did we miss anything? Anything else that was totally reshaped by this pandemic?
Well, there's one more thing we're thinking about. Remember all those people who died. That huge population drop, it had some surprising long-term effects, especially when it came to who owned land.
What do you mean?
Well, with so many people gone, land was up for grabs. Even people who never owned land before, they had a chance to get some.
So the Black Death actually changed who owned land.
In some cases, yeah. And that, combined with feudalism weakening, it really changed the social and economic landscape of Europe.
It's kind of amazing to think that one event, as horrible as it was, could have such a huge impact on so many things. Really was a turning point in history.
It really was. But we have to remember the Black Death's legacy is complex. It was destructive, but it also created opportunities, darkness and light.
That's a good point. Even the worst events can have unexpected, even positive outcomes.
Exactly. The Black Death is a story of resilience, how people adapt, the strength of the human spirit, and it's a story that still speaks to us today.
Okay, so we've covered a lot in this deep dive into the Black Death. But before we wrap things up, one more question.
What can we learn from this pandemic that happened so long ago?
That's a good question. What lessons can we take from this dark part of human history?
And how do those lessons help us understand pandemics, the ones in the past and the ones happening now?
Well, I think the Black Death shows us just how powerful disease is and how important public health is. It also shows how connected societies are, how pandemics affect everyone.
Yeah, those are important lessons. And I think it also shows how resilient humans are, how we can adapt and innovate, even when things are really bad.
I agree. The Black Death was a time of incredible suffering, but it also sparked so much change, so much innovation. It really shaped history.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the Black Death.
It's been a fascinating journey. It really has. We've seen how the Black Death wasn't just a period of death and disease, but a catalyst for profound change. It reshaped societies, economies, challenged beliefs, and even sparked new ways of thinking about the world. And as we conclude, we leave you with this. How have pandemics throughout history shaped the world we live in today? What can we learn from these past crises? And how can those lessons guide us as we face the challenges of the present and the future? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. So we've spent this whole episode really digging into the Black Death, all the horrors, but also those unexpected long-term changes.
Yeah.
It's definitely a story of devastation,
Oh, yeah.
but also, about resilience, adaptation, that enduring human spirit.
Right. It shows how even these catastrophic events that can really be catalysts for change, like reshaping whole societies, leaving a mark for generations.
Almost like the Black Death was this forced reset, pushed Europe in a whole new direction.
Yeah.
A direction that led to, advances in public health, a flourishing of arts, and, just thinking in new ways, and changes to social and economic systems.
Right. And I think that's a key takeaway here for our listener. The Black Death, as far back as it seems, it's got these valuable lessons for us, even now in the 21st century. It reminds us that pandemics, they're not just things of the past. They happen. They're part of the human experience.
And they can really change the course of history in ways you just can't predict. Makes you wonder, what echoes of those past pandemics are still around today?
That's a great question. And, I'd like to leave our listener with that thought to think about. As you think about everything we've talked about today, consider this. How have pandemics throughout history shaped our world? What can we learn from them? And how can we use those lessons for the challenges we face now and the ones that are coming?
Those are some powerful questions. And as we wrap up our deep dive into the Black Death, I encourage you to explore those questions, really dig into the history of pandemics, and think about how those experiences are still shaping our world today.
Thanks for joining us. I can